Hello, this is Maribel Gomez, and I am going to tell you a little bit about my action research project. I chose to do it on storytelling and second language acquisition in a dual language immersion class. The way I came up with this was out of curiosity to see if the same techniques that I'm using as a high school teacher will be incorporated, could work with the younger students, and if they could reach the same level quicker since they're learning it at an earlier age. How did this came up? I got the pleasure of meeting Dr. Krashen when I was just starting to do comprehensible input practices in my classroom back in Cincinnati at a conference. I got to hear him for an hour, and then he came to Savannah for a 2 day conference. I wanted one of the things is I wanted, like I said, I wanted to know if implementing early childhood would have the same effects. I wanted to know. I had a lot of questions in regard to input and output and compelling, and the focus of schools and that literacy. And I was, as I was reading more, I was actually full of more questions. Um, but Dr. Krashen's theory in acquisition, it says that acquisition requires meaningful interaction in the target language and natural communication, and in which speakers are concerned not only with the form but also with the message that's conveying, and so that kids can understand. That's actually one of my students, and we were talking about what they wanted to do when they were older, and they had to tell a story through pictures and then tell a story speaking, and that was within 3 weeks of being with me. As I was reading more into the book, I had a lot more questions, um, learning about the hypotheses, a lot of theories about the research out there for dual language classrooms. And I know that dual language classrooms um, focus more on the bilingual to create bilingual students, and I, as a teacher, focus more on the bilingual aspect. And then how can we incorporate all these cultures where all these kids are coming from, especially from reading the book and then from reading a lot of the other research and theories. I was just a little bit more puzzled, I guess. Um, but I wanted to know a little bit more. And as I was beginning to research, I found that there is some research out there in second language acquisition in the early ages using Krashen's theory, but not as much as I was hoping. A lot of it has to do with older kids. There is a lot of research on storytelling for regular language acquisition, and I wanted to know if that could be incorporated into second language as well. And as I began to look up a little bit more and more and read a little bit more, I find that it is possible. So I'll keep on going here. Um, I was recording this a little bit out of sequence, so bear with me. And then I started thinking I need to downsize my questions because this is going to take forever. And I do not have the 32 years that Collier and Thomas had. Um, Dual language immersion schools focus more on creating, like I said, biliterate students, versus I, as a foreign language teacher in a high school, in a non-dual language immersion class, I focus most on the bilingual. I do want them to be biliterate, but that is not real. The way I interpret biliterate is that you can take everything, be able to understand science and math and everything. Krashen's theory is that he's a firm believer of reading in libraries, and having children to read, and he believes that reading will create literacy and proficiency, and then you will become biliterate. So using his directive, I wanted to know, can this work in little kids? Can we close that gap of proficiency a lot earlier than what Collier and Thomas had in mind when they did their study? And like I said, there's a lot of research out there that talks about reading, um, but then the implementation on how you would do reading uh, in dual language immersion classes. I found in my research a study conducted by Dr. Gilliander and Dr. Castro. They were researchers at UNC in Chapel Hill, and they did a research for migrant kids in which they were put in classrooms in a dual language immersion setting with no language proficiency. And this was done in kindergarten, first grade. And in the panel that they did, they were talking about, they were asking questions in a panel to teachers and how they use reading. And some of the teachers said that when they were reading in English, the Latino students, were not interactive. They had no engagement whatsoever, and and they weren't producing anything. And I think a lot of that had to do with the way you're reading to children who are acquiring a second language. Part of Krashen's theory is that you had to make it compelling, you had to make it comprehensible. Even if you're reading from a book, you had to be very careful on what books you're selecting to read, especially for children that are acquiring a second language. And this research said that reading out loud to young dual language learners needs to be in a way that they can understand. In another research that I found, it talked about how reading stories to children will help them acquire that phonetic. So I, as a teacher, need to give them as much input as possible through reading, because they're gonna acquire the phonetics of the language more naturally. We take, especially with Spanish, which is a very phonetic language. It's easy. They start learning the mechanics, and then I found the phonological awareness continuum, which pretty much explains how children develop that phonetics. And through reading, it's easier because they're learning from you. In another research, and I actually found this in one of Krashen's research papers, but someone else had actually used it as well. And it tells you that through second language acquisition and through comprehensible language acquisition, where we focus more on the input and less on the academic, like on the grammatical way, on teaching them grammar reels and everything like that, that students tend to close that gap a lot closer. If you take a look, the level of proficiency becomes more predominant in 2 years when versus if you do it the grammatical way, I guess, the academic proficiency way. So he talked about how in this research, I learned that the first language is key to the foundations of the second language, and that is creating meaning. Students can understand if you're not creating meaning to them. If there's a word that puzzles them and they don't know it, they're going to be puzzled and they're not going to lose interest. So you had to create meaning. We can also, culture was another piece, and we can incorporate culture through the readings and through the stories, which is something that we already do as language teachers, but it's also something that we can create. When you use the culture of the student in the stories, they are more compelled to understand and be engaged. And also, like I say, make it meaningful, make it comprehensible, and that way you can close that gap a lot closer if you start using storytelling at an early age. It was a little bit fascinating to me that this is possible when you are when we're talking about early language acquisition in kindergarten, first and second, and possibly third grade, which is where a lot of the research is focused on, especially because they predict that that is usually where most of this is incorporated. Um, so, um, so can we use storytelling and story listening to increase or speed the second language acquisition in a dual language immersion classroom? could this be done? Could be the key to close that gap a little bit closer based on Collier and Thomas's research. According to the research that I found, and I know I find a lot more in here, but I cannot target the ones that focus on this language acquisition a little bit more. Of course, we have Krashen, who says that immersion, what immersion classes have taught us, or immersion schools have taught us, is that comprehensible subject matter teaching is language teaching. As long as we're teaching the matter that we're teaching, whether it's science, math, or any subject, in a comprehensible way, we're still teaching language. And as long as we're doing it comprehensible, we are creating language acquisition. And then I found three researchers that said that opportunities for authentic writing are important because early experience with printing material lead students to literacy development a lot earlier. And then, of course, we have Gallagher and Castro, who find that the research is out there that recommends storybook reading to promote early language and literacy on younger children. By listening to stories, children are learning about written syntax and vocabulary and develop phonetic awareness and concepts from the printed material at an early age. And then they are better to learning how to read and write. And it's the same research that Sufferman Government in Kent did with the ASO target and acquisition that you had to make it very engaging. And they also said the acquisition is highly social, and it's evident in the immersion dual language learners when you put a lot of context and you highlight we highlight better practices in our teaching. And of course we have Collier and Thomas, who did a biggest research, and that is where dual language immersion comes from. They use their research to put the programs together for dual language schools now, and they create the prism model, which incorporates all these theories in the development acquisition. But they also research on how long does it take for students to be bilingual, and research says that in dual language programs it takes about 4 to 7 years. And my research, or what I would love to know, is if we incorporate storytelling, can that gap be closer to 1 to 2 or 3 years instead of 4 to 7? Especially since there's a lot of research out there that says storytelling in early ages create literacy. And this is pretty much my task at hand. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.